Welcome to the KLOS 50 in Reverse podcast. This is the third installment as we spotlight the impact 95.5 KLOS has had on radio, rock and roll, and the community it has served for 50 years. I'm your host, Rita Wound, joined again by technical wizard Stu Herrera. Our spotlight for this episode is a show that originated on KLOS in 1981 and became an institution in the industry, Rockline. Our special guests are two people who served as producers for that show, Mark Felsot and Greg Jernigan. Welcome, gentlemen, to the KLOS 50 in Reverse podcast.
Hi, Rita.
That is Mark Felsot talking.
Hello, Rita.
And that's Greg.
Great to be
talking.
here.
Thank you so much for doing this.
By the way, I started as an intern at KLOS in 1977.
Is that right?
Yes.
1977. I started here in 1983, and you were already working like various different things, you know.
I was an old-timer by the time you got here.
Yeah. They're like, wow, got 6 years. And how about you?
I started on Rockline in 84. I wanted to meet the Scorpions, and I hung out outside the studio. And then I eventually became the gopher on the show. And then after Mark and Brian came to town and the phone screener left, CW, Mark hired me. And so I would have always given Mark the credit for getting me into radio.
Greg did it the right way. He just come out, hang out, and found a way to make himself useful and likable at the same time.
I sat on the curb, and the Scorpions took me on the road for 3 days.
Oh, my God. Where'd you go? Did you go to Pac Amp? Was that around the time?
It was Pac Amp, the Forum.
Did you go to the...
They're still investigating that story, I think.
Was that
That was 84, Love at First Sting tour.
Yeah, with Bon Jovi
Bon
opening
Jovi.
down at
That's right.
Pac Amp. I
I
was at
met
that
Bon
show.
Jovi for the
I
first
had to hop
time.
a barbed wire fence to get in there.
I wanted to meet them, and I came to KLOS, and they said it's not done here. It's done at another studio, Bert and Ernie's or something like that. And then I went and got caught climbing over a wall, discovered where they did Rockline. This is before paparazzi and all that, really. And I was good enough to just keep it quiet and not talk about it, got autographs, and sat on the curb and I'd heard that's how Prince got his first break, is he sat on the curb outside a recording studio.
That's killer.
And eventually Mark gave me a break.
Wow.
And Mark, you were here at KLOS, and originally the show had B. Mitchell Reed.
Beamer was the host from May when it debuted till October of 81. And in the middle of that, he had some health problems. And, it's an infamous story, but he had a heart attack literally right at the end of a show. And
Here at KLOS?
No, at the
At
Rockline studio.
Oh, my God, I didn't know that.
Nils Lofgren was the guest, and we were coming back from the last commercial break. Nils had his guitar because he was probably going to play something anyways in the last segment. And as the bumper music was playing, Beamer stood up, moved the microphone out of the way, walked past Nils and said, "Nils, can you play something?" And went out in the hallway and collapsed.
Oh, my God.
And Nils just starts playing to a room by himself, not knowing what's went on.
Wow.
Paramedics, they got the paramedics there quickly. And after a couple of minutes, we got somebody just to go in and while Nils was playing to start reading the credits and say goodnight,
Wow.
And it was wild. And
I think he only did about 6 shows or something like that, didn't he? On Rockline?
Who, Beamer?
Beamer,
No, he
yeah.
did more than that.
Okay.
He did more than that. But it was October when they finally...
Or maybe it was 6 months, not 6
Yeah,
shows.
6 months, yeah. When they brought Bob in. And, it was the right move.
And Bob was just such the perfect host.
Well, he was a natural. And he knew... the key to that show was transition, to go from the caller to your own question, the follow-up question, when you were done with the caller, you had to have the right feel for the pace of the show. And Bob was such a natural at it. And so everybody who came and did the show, they felt so comfortable because Bob was comfortable. And, it was easy for them. That was the most, you make the guests comfortable. They'll want to come back.
Yeah.
No,
so you were at KLOS, so you got the job at Rockline. That started in 1981. Were you working with Beamer also?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you were already there.
They did one show, And then I got a call from Tommy Hadges, our PD, who said, hey, you interested in screening phone calls on this new show, Rockline? Because whoever they were using for the first show was somebody who came with the studio, but they knew how to screen calls, but they didn't know anything about rock bands. So, and because I had been working with Michael Benner on the talk show at KLOS, screening phone calls, I went down to the second show and jumped in for half a show, and then me and this other guy split the time there for the next few months, and then finally they got rid of him, and so technically the second screener on the show. But
very cool. And then Greg, you got your job as a gopher to start off with?
I did. I was the gopher on the show, so that was actually a very fun time because I saw a lot of crazy things. Was first there, last to leave every night. And then, like I said, when Mark and Brian took off and got to town, Mark gave me the break, and then I became the screener for a number of years, then moved on to technical director.
But when he started, he was at the front door where everybody came in. So all the craziness that would go on downstairs at the front door that the rest of us who worked on the show were oblivious to. He got firsthand witness of, the crazies showing up with stuff to get autographed or demanding to be let in the building. It was nuts, and he got firsthand viewing for all of that. None of us, half the stories he has from watching what happened those early years, I know nothing about because we were upstairs getting ready for the show. So,
doing that, excellent. So B. Mitchell Reed knew Bob Coburn, and did he kind of just hand off the show to him?
Well, it wasn't
that easy.
No,
but he seemed like the perfect fit for it. I'm sure it wasn't.
He was. Wasn't a very for them too. It wasn't a very smooth transition. Because even though Beamer was older and had, health issues, he didn't want to let it go. Yeah. And, and then it's the guy following him on the air at the same radio station. So I think it was a little icy for a while, but, it was a change that had to be made for the future of the radio show. So.
And how long were you with Rockline, Mark?
Till July of 1992.
Okay. And when did you start, Greg?
I started in '84 until 2014. I worked for the show for 30 years.
Wow. Is there audio? We don't have it right now, but there's got to be recordings of those B. Mitchell Reed shows.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I have every show.
Really?
From back, every show has been digitized, archived, there's a record of every show.
Jimmy Rash, who was the longtime producer, engineer of the show, he went through and we digitized everything, so we've got them all.
Super. We've got some good little chestnuts that we're going to play tonight. Who was the first guest ever that Beamer brought onto Rockline?
The first guest.
I want to say it was Joe Walsh and Deep Purple. Maybe
no, it was Joe Walsh, and it was either Robbie Krieger from the Doors.
Yeah, that's right. I think so.
Yeah. I think Frank Zappa was an early guest. I think the Doobie Brothers were an early guest.
They were. A lot of half shows at that time, a lot of split shows.
Oh, so first half, what was it, a 1 hour or 2 hour
show? It was a 90-minute show.
90-minute show, 45 of 1 hour. Oh, my God. So you'd have two super-duper stars.
Well, or you would be, it's funny because you'd go back and see Kiss would do and the Stray Cats or something like that would do a show, split.
Wow.
Because neither one of them, were either that big at the time or they were still breaking out.
I remember the first time U2 were on, they were the second half of a show, and the first half was Elton John.
Oh, my God. Really?
I think it was Elton John for the first half and U2 for the second half, Because at that time, Elton John on rock radio was starting to not be
with those the little genie and those days.
Some of those new songs, people didn't want to play. So it was like, we'll do half with you, and then U2 was on from New York. Who did the second was for the War album.
Wow.
Yeah, that was awesome.
I think Stu found something from Bob's first official show on Rockline.
Yeah, and there's two ways to play this. Should I play the well, I'll just play it.
Is that Rod Stewart?
Who was the guest?
It was Rod Stewart.
Yeah.
And the introduction that he gives Rod Stewart is massive. And I created an edit of it just for tonight, with a kind of like dovetailed, the beginning and the end of it. But I think actually we should just play the whole thing. Here we go. Okay.
And now, from our studios in Hollywood, it's the host of Rockline, Bob Coburn.
All right, good evening to you. I am Bob Coburn, the new host of Rockline. We have a great show for you tonight with a very, very special guest, Rod Stewart, in the studio this evening. We also have Alan Freeman with London Calling, a live report of what's happening on the rock scene across the Atlantic, and, of course, your telephone calls. You can call Rockline toll-free at 800-421-32... or collect from within California, 213-520... Tonight we'll be tracing the musical history of one of rock's most distinctive vocal stylists. His whiskey voice tenor has intertwined itself into the very fabric of contemporary society. Though Rod Stewart has been releasing solo albums since the early 70s, there's a new LP ready for release, Tonight I'm Yours. I'd like to welcome vocalist extraordinaire Rod Stewart.
Well, I'm pleased I turned up after that introduction.
No, what are you going to say that's going to top the introduction?
That was absolutely amazing. It's all nearly true anyway.
We heard a little taste of Maggie Mae, and I think I'm going to have to hear that again, and I'm sure the people listening to Rockline would like to also. It's about 10 years since Maggie Mae came out now, right?
10 years. It was a hit in February 71.
And this is probably still one of your biggest albums, Every Picture Tells a Story.
I'm not too sure about that, but that's beside the point. I think probably Night on the Town's a bit bigger, and Blondes was bigger.
And Blondes was probably bigger, too.
But I'm not complaining about that.
I bet. Let's listen to Maggie Mae on Rock.
So, yeah, I'm sorry, that was the...
God, even to think about at the time, Maggie Mae was only 10 years old at the time.
Yeah, they're going, wow, it's been 10 whole years since Maggie Mae came out. Like,
I will say the great thing about Bob was he could write. And you just gave him the research. He wrote the intros. He wrote 25 to 30 questions for himself in case the phone callers had an off night. So he was always prepared with great questions. And man, I got to tell you, that talent is hard to replace.
And he did. And we all, especially when Bob, in 2003, Bob bought the show. And that's when he made me producer. And we were so prepared for every show, and Bob was so spot on. But we would each come in with our own questions, not to feed the callers, but just to prove to each other and show, the screeners to show us that they were ready. And they had done their research. And then we always had a go-to. And Bob and I had a look. We just had a look, and it was just a connection to know exactly where I was going and where he was going. And I know Mark had that too. But
I just pushed the intercom and talked in his ear.
Well, I did too. But and at that time, even the internet wasn't around at that time, so you're on an old green screen and you're typing on a program. You hope it doesn't fail that he's reading. And it's hard to communicate in beyond just simple text. You can't you can't get a feeling across. And Bob was very, very prepared.
And that's the thing with the Rockline too. When it started, there wasn't an internet, so you couldn't go find out your favorite band's favorite color if you wanted to do that, or why they wrote that song. What are your beliefs for the longevity? Why do you think it lasted so long and had such an impact, Mark?
Well, it was a unique concept to begin with. You're going to be live every Monday night. And when the show started, satellite technology was next to non-existent for commercial radio stations. The only radio stations that you could feed programming to that they could download on a satellite were national public radio stations. And so for the first 2 years of the show's existence, the only way you could carry the show was contacting your local NPR station in your town and say, would you download this show for us, and we'll pay to have broadcast lines put in from your station to our station. And that's how you got the show. And it wasn't until ABC came along and took over distribution and then gave every commercial radio station satellite dishes. And we went from like 40 stations to 120 stations in like 2 years because now everybody could get it. So that was one of the things. Bob's ability to be as great as he was every week was also part the reason for the longevity. And there was nothing else like it because we weren't where we are today, and that was really one of the ways that people could have communication with bands, and bands could have communication back, but in a very comfortable, controlled setting that made it easy for them.
The bands and the fans, when those people hung up the phone and when that band left the studio, it wasn't some like Bells and Whistles morning show where they didn't know, they had some scripted questions to ask. You walked away from the show as a fan or an artist going, that was a great interview. And that's what he taught. That's what Mark taught me. That's what Bob taught me. And then also when ISDN technologies came along, that really expanded it even more, and we moved to 2 nights a week.
The key too is we didn't want it to be a fluff show. We wanted to have bands really talk about stuff that maybe they weren't comfortable talking about. And sometimes managers and record people got mad, but it was the phone callers. That was our safety net.
They were never
the callers.
They were never told the questions.
The callers wanted to know. It wasn't us pressing the issue, and you deal with it. This is your opportunity to tell your side.
That was my
of the
question.
story.
So those managers and PR guys couldn't come in and say, "Okay, this topic's off limits." And
Well,
this
they
topic,
tried
to,
They
right?
could.
They
They did a
say
little.
that.
They tried to. I remember one artist that, they were very particular on her first couple records that we didn't talk about her sexuality. And then a couple albums later, it was all they wanted to talk about. So it went both ways.
I could guess who that.
They went both ways.
Yeah, see what you did
I guess
there.
not. Huh? One thing that always struck me about Bob was just how much he loved listening to music. I remember going out to, he had the red Mercedes, and he had this disc changer in the back, and he had like 10 different CDs going at the time. That he was listening to. And it's like, how do you do that? He goes, I try to listen to 5 or 10 CDs a week. Just to keep up on things, and he was always into to new music and rediscovering the great stuff about the old songs. He taught me so much about music.
As a host, you have to try to relate to the bands and as musicians and understand what they liked as players and who they listened to. And, if they start talking about, we were big Howlin' Wolf fans and Muddy Water fans, your host better not go, oh, God, I've never really listened to,
that?
Exactly. So it really wasn't a job for him because he liked doing that. But that's part of what made him so good is he was such a fan of music.
He always talked about he had this gigantic vinyl collection. And he had moved a couple times, and I hadn't seen it because vinyl, it was really about CDs then. But he also talked about having 20,000 CDs. Right. And when his wife put together Lynette put together his CD room after he passed, he had 20,000 CDs.
Dude, I was there.
The record parlor, when they sold his record collection, it was amazing how eclectic. And the guy was definitely a student.
Yeah.
Back in the day when you could buy a used album for $1.50 in mint condition.
Yeah, exactly.
I couldn't believe the worth of the vinyl today.
Yeah, it's a whole different.
Damn it.
Let's talk about some of the memorable shows. I'm Rita Wild along with Stu Herrera. It's KLOS 50 in reverse with Greg Jernigan. Hello, Greg.
Hello again.
And Mark Falsott.
Hello, Rita.
Producers of Rockline for many a year. And I'd say all of us pretty decent friends with Bob and got to know him and respect him as an individual and just for the artist he was. Most memorable shows.
Well, the first one that always pops in my head is George Harrison.
Okay.
Yeah, that's...
And, George had come out of, nothingness and does Cloud 9, with Jeff Lynne producing. And Jeff Lynne had been away from the scene. Right. ELO wasn't doing anything. And George agreed to do the show, and we wanted to see if he would play. And, of course, the label's like, don't even ask. It'll never happen. Forget about it. And I said, well, listen, we show up with some guitars. Anything can happen. I remember going to Cloud 9, he was holding a guitar in his hand. Yeah. And I remember taking that to Westwood Music and talking to the owner, and I said, "This guitar, you got this guitar?" He goes, "Oh, it's a 55. I have a 56. I need to rent it." And then I told him, I said, "I got George Harrison,
a Martin."
And it was a Martin?
No, it was a Gretsch.
Was it? I thought it was a Martin.
We the second guitar we rented was a Martin,
a hollow body electric, right?
Yes,
right.
And so I had two great guitars, and the guy told me, he said, if George walks in the room and sees these two guitars, if one of them is not in his hands in 15 seconds, then he won't play. So him and Jeff get there. First off, they were being chased by fans, so there was a little all that going, and he was a little, unsure of himself when he got there, but then had a few beers and he was fine. And in 10 seconds, him and Jeff Lynne had those guitars in their hands, and I just thought somehow this is going to happen tonight. And we made a deal with them. We were like, we'd love for you to play. And then he was like, well, I brought this CD that I'd love for you to play because if people want to know what inspires me, this is what I listen to. And it was a Bulgarian choir.
Wow.
And he even said, he goes, I don't expect you to play a whole song, but if you play some so people can understand what I listen to for inspiration. And, I'm like, done deal.
Yeah.
And eventually he was still teetering though. And then my boss said, if you play, you can keep the guitars.
Whoa. What?
Who was that?
Howie Gilman.
Howard Gilman did it?
So you can keep the guitars. So
wow.
The show goes on.
Both of them?
Both of them, yeah. Now, so now the show starts. It's a 2-hour special edition. It's not 90 minutes. It's 2 hours. And we thought, you know what? Let's not even broach the subject until he's comfortable doing the show and taking calls. Maybe we'll wait till like the hour mark. And then maybe we'll ask. But all during the commercial breaks, him and Jeff Lynne sat in with him but didn't say anything. But all during the commercial breaks, him and Jeff started playing songs to each other. So you could hear sometimes when we came back from commercial breaks, you could hear the tail end of George and Jeff strumming.
Wow.
And before I was going to have a caller ask them to play. I was going to plant it. Before I could do that, I'll never forget this girl, April from Edmonton. Her name and city etched to my brain forever. Said, well, before I get to my question, it sounds like, George, you have a guitar there. Are you going to play something? And I'm just like, oh, my God.
Thanks,
April. And George went on to sort of tell the story. He said, well, me and the owner are trying to strike a deal. And then he's like, I would, but, I want, all I asked is if they would play something from this CD I brought. And I'm pushing into Bob's headphones, tell him yes. And 20 seconds later, George, off he went. He started playing a version of something. He played a bit of Here Comes the Sun. He played some Bob Dylan and some Burr. I mean, we got like half scraps of about 7 different songs in that second hour that were amazing, absolutely amazing.
We got to come back. You got to come back.
Yeah.
Go on with some of that, man.
Oh my God, that's some of that.
The funny thing about that show as a highlight and a low light being the gopher was the low light was there was one of my jobs was to hang a vinyl Rockline banner that everyone took pictures in front of. And like Mark said, George, relaxed, got a little loosened up when he got there. And at the end of the show, we were all taking a picture, and he leaned into the banner too far, and the banner fell on him and basically draped him.
No.
And Howie Gilman looked at me, and I was like, I'm dead.
Let's see. So we know somebody who almost nailed Jackson Brown.
That's me.
And now somebody who almost got George Harrison. Wow.
And then,
we need a trifecta here.
But what then happened after that is they stuck around after the show, and this is
the after show was
for 4 hours. I think Mark and I.
Well, it wasn't that long,
was it?
No, but it was.
Seemed like it.
It seemed like it.
And
there was a room at the studio.
It was a jingle house.
There was a couple couches and there was a piano in there, and they sort of just went in there for privacy, okay? But they took their guitars with them, and George and Jeff Lynne proceeded to perform.
Like
the best word for there was a couple record company people, and as the staff was done walking in there, George would start a Bird song, and him and Jeff, and then Jeff, of course, would start a Beatles song because he was one of the biggest Beatle fans ever. And we're in there, and I mean, when I walked in, the only place for me to sit was on the edge of the couch next to George Harrison.
Oh, bummer.
And
I hate you.
And there's a picture from Billboard of that night.
Oh my God!
But I me and the engineer, one of the engineers for the studio there, we like eyeballed each other, and through our eye contact, I was asking, is there any way you can quietly leave the room and sneak a microphone back in the room?
Right.
And he was eyeballing me to say next to impossible. But we were both on the same wavelength. Like we have to have something for the, to tell people this actually happened.
So there was one picture that came out in Billboard magazine. For me, the funny thing too at the end was when I took him to the car, I was the one that took him downstairs, and people were waiting outside still, even after those couple hours for George. I was like, George, arm in arm, I'll get you to the car. I'm gonna, we're locked in elbows. Right. We get outside, and being British, he went to the wrong side of the car.
Oh, of course.
and we got separated, and then I had to catch him again and push people away and get him in the car. And thanks, mate.
But having Beatles on was always a big deal. We had Paul McCartney and a couple times, and Paul was like the complete opposite. Paul would drive himself. Everybody's outside looking for the limo. And all of a sudden, McCartney in a convertible comes cruising by everybody, pulls into a parking spot, walked into the building, and nobody outside saw that it was him. And he was great. He would, he would send somebody down and say, go collect all their albums and bring them to me. And as the show goes on, I'll sign them,
Smart man. That way I can.
That was the first show I gophered.
Wow. Oh, really?
Yeah, it was Paul McCartney. It came out swinging.
Wow. Now, was George on just the one time?
While I was there, I don't know if he did it a second time after I was gone.
No, I don't think he did, but I do, and I have the guitar pick he gave me, the Cloud 9 guitar pick, and then I found another guitar pick that's odd. It was a different named Wilbury, and after a little research, I realized it was Gary Moore's.
Gary Moore's?
Yeah, because he played a little.
He played on one Wilbury song.
Yeah. He did?
Yes.
Oh my God!
No way! I never knew that.
She's My Baby from Volume 3.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this was having him on Rockline with Jeff Lynne. Was pre-Wilburys then, or
it was before they had already started, I think. Wow! But there was no mention of it yet, because his album was out and Petty was working on Full Moon Fever. I mean, all of this sort of happened within like an 18-month period. It was like, oh my God, look at it all got created. It was pretty intense. Just briefly, because I do some work with Tom Petty. After the Rockline show, George and Jeff went over to Tom Petty's house with their guitars, and were telling Tom what happened. And they were up till like the sun came up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and just drinking beer and playing tunes, and
We're thinking of another Rockline show right now that took place in Atlanta in 1984.
Oh yeah.
Were you guys, now how did that work technically? Where were you guys? Were you there too?
No. Bob went to Atlanta. So Bob was with Van Halen in the same room in Atlanta, and the rest of us, and my boss, Cindy Tolan, who was for that show, was the producer. So I was the associate producer. We were back in L.A. where all the music came from, where all the and all we did was feed them everything from there. And we just, we were trying to visualize what was going on there. It was insane.
Well, we have that show. It was pretty tough to figure out like what snippet to pull from it, because you could literally pull the waveform of the whole show up and drop the playhead anywhere, and it just sounds like a riot the whole time. So here's a little bit of that, and I figured out a way around our technical issue. So here's a little snippet from the Van Halen show in 1984.
Welcome. It's Van Halen live on the air. I'm David Lee Roth.
I'm Michael Anthony.
And good afternoon from Alex. Thank you. Together we are Van Halen.
When I flew out from Los Angeles, I had 5 marriage proposals for David that I was supposed to pass on, and also about 20 questions that it seems like everybody wanted to know the same thing. What the hell is on the inside of the album jacket? The little round things on the inside sleeve.
It's called a record. It's Alex Van Halen. Alex Van Halen representing the United States, going for the full point.
Live from After one inning, Alex won. The rest of us nothing. What is that? Seriously?
Well, actually, what it is something purely designed to confuse you, Bob.
A job well done.
That's not too difficult.
Like you said, Alex, timing is of the essence. We're going to play a song from 1984 by Van.
So they never found out.
Well, you got to remember, Roth shows up with a boom box, okay, where that background music is.
Is that where that was?
Because that's him orchestrating part of what's going on in the air. So they've got their music going on in the background to like give them the energy. And there were. You know, I remember at one point on the air, you just go, Bob's talking, he goes, "Oh my," and she took her clothes off just now. I mean, there were strippers in the studio. There was, it was radio debauchery. But as you can hear, it was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Yeah.
And plus that tour was just crazy anyway, the 1984 tour.
Yeah.
I remember when they played the Forum, you know, you walk in and there's these amplifiers that are like 18 feet high. I mean, it was all show. But I was, I think, working mornings at the time, so I stayed at the hotel across the street at the Forum, and so did like the entire road crew.
Oh, yeah. Awesome.
So there was no sleep. A lot of biopics are really the rage these days. Queen, obviously. I know that Brian May was on the show. Did Freddie Mercury ever do the show?
We never got Freddie. We always had Brian and Roger. And because, I don't know, I'm trying to think. You know, there was a period where, you know, Queen was not welcomed by American radio, you know, because they really got into the European sort of disco.
Starting with Hot Space.
But when they sort of came back, I think when they signed with Hollywood Records, they started making some rock again, and we had them on. But I think already Freddie had AIDS by that time, at least the beginning stages. And these guys were terrific. They were gracious. They were so appreciative of doing the show. They protected Freddie as best as any two guys could. But they were terrific. We just grew to love Brian and Roger. They were wonderful.
The other biopic, Motley Crue, just came out, Dirt. Were they ever on the show?
Oh, we have similar shows than like the Van Halen.
I'm trying to think if I was there when Motley Crue, if I had them on. I must have had them on. I don't remember.
Seems like
they were on a lot.
Well, I guess you could forget it too.
They were on a lot, especially toward like I can tell you a couple stories, for instance, and Vince one night we had him on, and they were in Texas. Vince basically passed out on the mixing board. On the middle mixing board, not like a little Mackie mixer they had there, and took us off the air. And Mick Mars had
in the room with Bob there too?
No, they were in Texas.
Okay, gotcha.
And we were knocked off the air. And then when we got back on the air, it was just Mick Mars. And I remember telling Mick.
Quiet one.
Yeah, and I told Mick Mars this when they came on for Saints of Los Angeles, and I was we were reliving the story, and I told him, I said, I never thought I'd say, thank God for Mick Mars. And then there was another one where at a point where Vince had caused a number of episodes on the show, and Bob had gotten, tired of it, to be honest.
Yeah.
And Vince came on the show, and he was ready to go at it, just feisty. And it was one of those times you watch someone go through the whole drunken state of I hate you, man, to the end of I love you, man, at the end of the show. And I don't know if he even made it through that one either. But yeah, we had some very challenging shows with them, and the other guys were very professional all the time, and so was Vince for the most part. But it was very much like the Van Halen, and
that's Bob's skills as a diplomat there.
But going back to the Queen, those two guys, and especially Brian May, absolutely adored Bob.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when Brian became the astrophysic and put out that book that he did, he sent Bob one of the first copies of it.
A couple of things I remember. There was that one show with Bill Clinton and Al Gore. I mean,
that was after my time.
That was just so cool because it was Rock the Vote, and it just was really getting people involved with it. And it was like such a kind of a left turn, but it was like the right turn. It was great.
It was at a university in Colorado. Even those that were there, whoever was involved with the show had to get a background check clearance.
Wow.
Bono called into the show.
Did he really?
Yeah, Bono called in.
Of course he did.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was a big show. It was an epic picture of Bob sitting there with those two.
That's great. Have to ask you one story that Bob told me, and I don't know if it can really be repeated or not, but Guns N' Roses.
Well, yes, it can be repeated. Guns N' Roses were on, and we had Duff, Slash, and Izzy, the three of them. And they were on the second half of a show. The first half was Robin Trower, and he was on a remote somewhere. So they were in L.A., and there must have been 50 people who came down, and everybody's partying or whatever. So we put them on, the three of them talked over each other for 45 minutes. I mean, literally nothing good came out of that show. And then with about 10 minutes before we went to the last commercial break, all of a sudden you hear Slash turn and go, "Does anybody have a brown bag?" And he pushes the microphone away. And Duff has a bottle in a brown bag, and so he gives Slash the brown bag. And I'm watching as Slash turns away from the microphone and pukes into the brown bag. Now, because he pushed the mic away, it is really far off in the background, because I remember listening back to the tape going, "Oh, you can't really hear it, you know." And so I'll never forget, because somebody from the record company had said that, these guys were cleaning their act, they weren't drinking and all that. And I remember yelling at the record guy going, so not drinking, eh? And he goes, "Slash had a bad artichoke for lunch." And I go, "Well, a bad artichoke and a fifth of whiskey would probably make you puke, So what happened is we went to commercial, we came back, and we had 10 minutes left in the show. We played Paradise City, which was 5.5 to 6, and we literally said goodnight at 5 minutes to 10. Wow. And that's what caught wind that something was up. And people, I was getting phone calls the next morning about all these stories about Slash threw up all over our walls, and we've banned Guns N' Roses for life. And
yeah, the story I heard was that he puked on Bob.
He didn't puke on Bob.
Yeah.
No. The image of what might have happened was far better than what actually. In fact, we never sent a tape out of the show to anybody because it would never match what you thought happened. But word got back to Axl about what happened, and Bob had said some negative things about the night, and we ended up, I think later that year, we did a special edition with just Axl. And I'll never forget Axl when he sat down, and his opening thing was, he goes, or maybe he saved it for later, he said, "Bob, I just got to tell you, when I got here, I wanted to beat you up for the way you treated those." And then he goes, "But you have been nothing but gracious to me. I've had like the best time." I mean, raved about how great it was. But he came in with this chip on his shoulder and ended up having a really good time. So,
but again, everything was hearsay at the time. There wasn't a lot of internet. And I will say, and I am tight with that crew and that gang, and spent some time with them in Italy this summer. Slash and Duff and Axl wasn't on a whole lot after that, but Slash and Duff were incredibly gracious to Rockline throughout the years, and especially what Slash did for his memorial. He helped us to record a bit for the memorial video we did. He gave a signed guitar that we auctioned off at the Canyon Club, the Ride for Bob. I believe, sadly, Frank bought that guitar, and I'm only going to assume that it's lost now.
Oh, Frank from the morning show.
From the morning show, Frank. Probably, yeah. Right. But sadly, yeah. So, but yeah, Slash and his manager went out of the, they were out of this world, gracious for us. And not only that, but proceeding in all the solo records they did, Slash's Snake Pit and all his solo work, Duff's solo work.
Bob was a big fan of everything that those guys did.
Absolutely loved those guys. Yeah.
It was good rock and roll.
But Slash, throughout all the years, still got asked about that night at Rockline because there was a few months afterwards in like Cree magazine, one of the magazines, there was a shot of Slash and Duff on like hotel room beds, passed out. But the corner table in the middle of the two beds was the Rockline coffee mugs.
Oh my God!
And the pad of paper.
And the pad of paper that said Rockline and Global Satellite Network on the side.
Yeah.
And he, years later, he said, I wish people would stop asking me about that night, but it was,
That's what infamy is. You can't pay for that.
That's right.
We're running against the clock here for our time-wise, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what both of you have been doing since Rockline. And Greg, you were really instrumental when in Bob's passing and putting together the memorial and then coming in here and doing some of the Rockline replay stuff. Mm-hmm. So what have you been doing since?
So I always worked Rockline as a second job, basically, for a number of years. I worked at Capitol Records during the day. I had gotten the job there because I followed Rob Halford back to his hotel one night after Rockline and met Bruce Dickinson, and I was an absolute metalhead and Iron Maiden fan, and ended up getting that job there, and I was the mothership EMIs. I built their first computer network in the U.S., so I was doing IT. So I do cybersecurity now, and I manage a local heavy metal band called the Mendenhall Experiment, which is all about raising disability awareness because the kid has cerebral palsy. And
is this the one that you made the movie about?
And we just made a movie about that. It's coming out. It's been winning awards everywhere. Called Mind Over Matter.
Mind Over Matter.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
there we go.
And there it is right there.
And there it is
there you
right
go.
there.
Thank you, Stu. There's the CD.
Greg, obviously way smarter than the rest of us.
Yeah.
Yes. I built their first computer network.
Wow. And how about you? You low life? Are you doing anything?
Yeah, Mark.
Well, let's see. In 2002, I started working for Little Steven when he was launching his radio show, The Underground Garage, and I worked for him for 10 years. And then in 2004, on a part-time basis, I started working with Tom Petty when he launched a show on XM satellite at the time called Tom Petty's Buried Treasure, and did that. And then in 2015, they gave him his own 24/7 channel, and so I've been working on Tom Petty Radio ever since.
And you host the morning show, too.
I do the morning show there. I do
special features.
I produce all the other guest DJ shows and stuff like that, and it's a labor of love, especially now.
Well, it's interesting because of both working with Bob so closely and working with Tom so closely. I mean, two huge instrumental figures in our lives that have passed on, and you guys are really carrying the torch. I want to thank you very much. Greg Jernigan, thank you again.
Thank you for having me, Rita.
And Mark Felsant, nice to see you again. Maybe out on an Angel game one of these years.
Oh, Mike Trout. Yes.
Mike Trout.
Thank you, Rita. It's always a pleasure.
Money well spent.
And Stu, thank you. It's always great to hang out with Stu and Rita.
He's awesome,
We're way overdue. We still have that little...
this was in 1986 when I think Tim Kelly was the PD of the station, and I was doing mornings until we waited to get somebody else along with Chuck Moshantz, and this internet company or computer company sent us over to Hawaii. It was like a Sing Your Way to Hawaii contest. So we were broadcasting live. Bob did the middays. He was broadcasting live. Gino and I think Steve Downs was there also broadcasting.
I mean, the whole air staff was in Hawaii.
And mind you, I had the morning show. 6 a.m. here is 3 a.m.
Basically, you had overnights.
Oh, but it was, and with Joe, who had never slept, so you can imagine what that was. But when we were signing off the broadcast, listener Doug sent this in, and it just meant so much to me because Bob was giving some thank yous, and Joe wanted to interrupt the show and thank Bob.
95.5 KLOS, that's John Cafferty with the Beaver Brown Band on the Dark Side from the soundtrack of the film Eddie and the Cruisers, and also Creedence Clearwater Revival with Someday Never Comes. Joe Walsh missed you on the boat cruise last night. That was a lot of fun.
Well, my monster went to sleep, Bob. I got a quick thank you, too.
What's that?
I mean this sincerely. Thanks for doing Rockline.
Oh, sure.
Period, regardless of who the guest is.
No, well, thanks.
Thanks for doing that.
Yeah. That's how I make my living.
I know, but it's so nice not to talk to some idiot. And I'm speaking for all us artists.
Well, thanks.
It's nice to have some. You're only as good as the questions. when
thanks.
you're an artist. And I mean that. That's a little corny, but I thought I'd throw that in.
Oh, shucks. We'll be right back.
There you go.
All right, we'll have another KLOS 50 in Reverse podcast next month. I'm not going to say who it is, but you definitely have to tune in. I'm Rita Wild. Till next time, thank you, Stu. Thank you, Mark. Thank you,
Thanks,
Greg.
Rita.
Thanks, Rita. Thanks, Stu.
50 in Reverse.